Imagine you are standing in a market. There is food in front of you, still warm, rice wrapped in banana leaf, curry steaming in a metal bowl. You are hungry. Genuinely hungry. The kind of hungry that makes your hands shake a little. And you have money in your pocket. Enough to buy that food 10 times over. But you cannot use it. Not because it is illegal. Not because the vendor will not accept it. You cannot use it because the moment you touch that bill, something inside your own vow breaks. A relic. A strange old rule for a simpler time. Something monks used to do before the modern economy existed, before anyone needed a bank account just to survive. That is the story most people carry around in their heads. Sweet, quaint, irrelevant. Here is what is actually true. Right now, today, in this exact moment, there are monks walking through cities with functioning banks, functioning phones, functioning stock markets, who will not let a coin or a bill touch their skin. Not symbolically, literally. In parts of Thailand and Myanmar and Sri Lanka, a monk who accidentally receives cash in his hand is required, by centuries-old code, to treat it like contamination. He cannot spend it. In the strictest interpretations, he is meant to formally give it up, sometimes even discard it, before continuing his day. This is not nostalgia. This is an active, living rule, followed by hundreds of thousands of people, inside economies that run on smartphones and cryptocurrency. So the real question is not why did old monks avoid money a long time ago? The real question is why grown adults, living inside 2026, still refuse to hold a 50-baht note, and what they might understand about money that the rest of us, buried under credit card debt and salary stress and the low hum of financial anxiety that never quite turns off, have completely lost. Let's get into it. This rule is not folklore. It is not a rumor that got exaggerated over centuries the way old stories tend to. It comes from an actual legal document, so to speak, one of the oldest continuously followed legal codes on earth. It is called the Vinaya, the monastic discipline laid out for Buddhist monks roughly 2,500 years ago. And within it sits a rule so specific it almost sounds like a joke. Monks are forbidden from accepting gold or silver, not spending it irresponsibly, not hoarding it, accepting it, touching it, holding it in the hand at all. The rule sits inside a category called the Nisajja Pachitya, offenses that require a monk to formally forfeit something before being purified of the wrongdoing. Handling money sits in the same category as things like hoarding excess robes or storing food improperly. It was written down, debated, commented on, and preserved by monastic communities for 2.5 millennia, translated across Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, and eventually into every language Buddhism ever spread to. This is not a soft suggestion. This is codified law inside a religious tradition older than most nations currently in existence. And here is the layer that makes it genuinely strange to modern ears. It is not a rule about greed in the abstract sense, the way most religions warn against loving money too much. It is a rule about the physical object itself, the metal, the coin. In its earliest form, monks were told not to accept gold or silver directly. Later, as currency evolved, the rule expanded to cover paper money too. The prohibition attaches to the substance passing through the hand, not merely to the emotional attachment behind it. Why would anyone build a rule this specific? Why not just say, generally, don't get greedy, and leave it at that? To understand that, you have to understand what the earliest Buddhist monks actually were, structurally, inside their society. They were not supposed to be producers. They were not farmers, merchants, or craftsmen. They were, by design, a mendicant order, wandering ascetics who owned almost nothing and depended entirely on the generosity of ordinary people for food, clothing, and shelter. Their entire economic existence was built around receiving, not earning. And the moment a monk starts handling currency the way a merchant does, buying, selling, negotiating, accumulating, the entire structure that separates a monk from a merchant starts to dissolve. There are 3 separate reasons layered underneath this single rule, and the third one is the one that will genuinely reframe how you think about your own relationship with money by the end of this video. The first reason is about dependence, deliberately engineered dependence. A monk who cannot touch money cannot buy his own food. He must rely on the alms round, walking through villages each morning with a bowl, receiving whatever ordinary people choose to give. This is not incidental to the practice. It is the practice. The alms round, called Pindapata, forces total interdependence between the monastic community and the lay community. Monks need lay people to survive physically. Lay people, according to the tradition, need monks spiritually, because giving generates merit, a kind of accumulated spiritual credit that improves one's karma and future rebirths. Strip money out of the equation entirely, and you get a relationship that cannot be transactional. You cannot pay a monk. You can only give to one, and he can only receive. The second reason is about equality inside the monastic community itself. Historical texts describe early monastic disputes, arguments over food, arguments over robes, arguments over who received better treatment from wealthy patrons. Money, more than almost anything else, tends to recreate hierarchy. The moment some monks have more of it than others, you get exactly the social stratification the whole system was designed to escape. By removing money entirely from an individual monk's hands, and instead requiring donations to flow through a designated lay steward, called a kapiya, who manages funds on behalf of the monastery collectively, the tradition tried to build a firewall against internal inequality. And the third reason, the one that goes deeper than economics or hierarchy, is psychological, almost neurological in how precisely it targets a specific mental habit. Buddhist philosophy identifies craving, tanha, as the root cause of suffering, not money itself. The craving for it, the endless mental loop of wanting more, comparing, calculating, worrying. And here is the insight that modern behavioral psychology has, remarkably, independently confirmed. The mere physical act of touching and handling money activates measurable psychological effects. Researchers studying what is sometimes called the psychology of money priming have found that simply handling cash, even briefly, can shift people's behavior, making them more individualistic, less likely to help others, more focused on personal gain, within minutes, without the person even consciously noticing the shift. The ancient rule was not written with fMRI machines or behavioral economics labs, and yet it arrived, through pure observation of human nature repeated across thousands of lives, at almost the exact same conclusion contemporary science keeps landing on independently. Touching money changes how you think, subtly and quickly. Removing that constant low-grade priming from a monk's daily experience was, whether the original authors framed it this way or not, a form of applied cognitive engineering, 2,000 years before the term existed. Now here comes the practical problem, the one that anyone paying attention should already be asking. If monks cannot touch money, and monasteries obviously need money, robes, food storage, building repairs, electricity now, transportation, medical care, how does any of this actually function? The answer is a workaround so elegant it has survived, largely intact, for over 2,000 years. It is the role of the kapiya, sometimes translated as a monastery attendant or steward. This is typically a layperson, sometimes a devoted volunteer, sometimes a formally appointed employee, who acts as an intermediary between money and the monk. When a donor wants to give a monk something that requires purchasing, new sandals, medicine, a bus ticket to visit a sick relative, the donor does not hand the monk cash. The donor tells the kapiya what they wish to provide, hands the money to the kapiya, and the kapiya makes the purchase and delivers the finished item, the object itself, to the monk. The money never crosses into the monk's hands at any point in the chain. On paper, this might sound like a technicality, a loophole dressed up in ceremony. In practice, monastic communities treat the distinction as genuinely serious, not decorative. The intention behind the rule, non-attachment, non-accumulation, non-negotiation, is preserved even while the practical needs of running a religious institution in the 21st century get met. And this is where the story gets almost absurdly modern. In Thailand today, some temples have started using something called a monk's alms bowl fitted with a QR code, allowing devout Buddhists who no longer carry cash, because almost nobody does anymore, to scan and donate digitally during the morning alms round. The money still does not touch the monk's hand. It flows instead into a temple account managed entirely by lay administrators. A tradition originally built to separate monks from coins now runs, unironically, on the exact same digital payment infrastructure used to buy coffee and pay rent. The ancient rule did not get abandoned when technology changed. It simply got translated, again, into whatever medium currency happens to take in a given century. But not every monastic community draws this line the same way, and this is the part of the story that gets genuinely complicated, and honestly a little uncomfortable for the tradition itself. In stricter Theravada communities, particularly among forest monks who follow what is called the Dhutanga ascetic practices, the prohibition on touching money is taken with extreme literalism. Some monks will refuse to even step over a coin lying on the ground. Others, if cash is placed directly into their hands by a well-meaning but uninformed tourist, will not scold the person, but will formally set the money aside afterward, sometimes physically discarding it, treating the accidental contact as something requiring ritual correction rather than punishment. In more liberal or reformist branches of Buddhism, and in many Mahayana traditions practiced across China, Korea, and Japan, monks routinely handle money directly, manage temple finances personally, and in some cases run substantial business operations tied to temple property, tourism, and religious tourism. The rule was never universal in practice, the way it is universal in text. And then there is the scandal layer, the part that every honest version of this story has to include, because pretending otherwise would be dishonest to what is actually happening on the ground. In Thailand, one of the most Buddhist countries on earth, there have been repeated, well-documented controversies involving monks caught with enormous personal fortunes, luxury cars, private jets in at least one widely reported case, bank accounts holding sums equivalent to millions of dollars, funded by donations meant for the temple but funneled instead into personal accumulation. These cases generate genuine public outrage, specifically because they violate something the public still deeply believes in. Nobody gets angry at a monk owning a private jet unless they still believe, somewhere underneath the anger, that monks are supposed to own nothing at all. The scandal only works as a scandal because the ideal still holds cultural weight. The rule has not disappeared. It has simply, in certain documented cases, been violated by individuals who exploited the trust the rule was originally built to protect. There is a fourth wrinkle to this story that rarely gets mentioned, and it involves a monk considered one of the most influential Buddhist teachers of the last century. Ajahn Chah, a Thai forest monk who founded a lineage now practiced across dozens of monasteries worldwide, was famous for an almost obsessive strictness around the money rule, even by forest tradition standards. Students who trained under him have described watching him refuse to so much as gesture toward a donation envelope placed in front of him during a ceremony, physically turning his body away until a layperson removed it from his line of sight. Visitors sometimes assumed this was performative, a kind of theater meant to impress. People who spent years living under his guidance insisted it was not performance at all. It was, they said, the most consistent thing about him, morning and night, decade after decade, whether anyone important was watching or nobody was watching at all. Compare that to the monastic economy of medieval Japan, where entire Zen temple complexes eventually became landowners, moneylenders, and commercial operators in their own right, some of them wealthy enough to fund private armies during periods of civil conflict. Historians studying temple records from this era have documented monasteries that operated essentially as financial institutions, extending loans to farmers and merchants, collecting interest, accumulating property across generations. The same religion, the same original text, the same founding rule against touching gold and silver, produced two wildly different outcomes depending on the century, the country, and the specific lineage carrying the tradition forward. Rules do not enforce themselves. People decide, generation after generation, how literally to take them, and how much cultural and economic pressure it takes before the letter of a rule starts bending to fit the moment. Even within a single country today, the line moves depending on context. In Myanmar, forest monasteries in remote regions still operate almost entirely on the traditional alms system. No digital payments, no bank accounts, monks walking for hours each morning collecting whatever rice and curry villagers choose to offer. Meanwhile, urban temples in Yangon, serving business people and tourists, have quietly adopted mobile payment systems for temple donations, run gift shops selling amulets and blessed objects, and in some documented cases, maintain formal nonprofit corporate structures to manage multi-million-dollar renovation projects. Ask a monk from the forest tradition what he thinks of the urban temple's spreadsheet software, and you get a very different answer than if you ask the urban abbot managing a real construction budget with real contractors who expect to be paid on time, in the currency that exists right now, not the currency that existed when the rule was first written down. Here is the part of this video that nobody expects, the twist that reframes everything you just heard. The rule against touching money was never really about money. Stay with that for a second, because it sounds like a contradiction of everything explained so far, and it is not. The Vinaya rule specifically targets gold and silver, the literal precious metals, because in the era the rule was written, gold and silver were the only forms of currency that existed. The rule's authors were not making a statement about coins as objects. They were making a statement about a mental relationship, the relationship of ownership, accumulation, and personal security through material wealth. Money was simply the most efficient, most universal symbol of that relationship available at the time. The actual target was never the metal in the hand. It was the tightening grip around the idea that safety and identity come from what you possess. This distinction matters enormously because it explains something that otherwise looks like a glaring inconsistency. Monks in wealthy monasteries can live surrounded by extraordinary material comfort, ornate temples, elaborate ceremonial objects, valuable religious artifacts, without violating the spirit of the rule, so long as none of it is personally owned, personally negotiated, personally accumulated by the individual monk. A monk can sit inside a temple worth millions and still be, technically and spiritually, poorer than a beggar on the street outside, because ownership, not proximity to wealth, is the actual violation the rule was built to prevent. And this is where the mirror turns directly toward you, the person watching this, sitting wherever you are right now, almost certainly with a phone in your pocket, connected to at least one bank account, and probably several recurring subscriptions you forgot you were even paying for. Because the anxiety Buddhist monks identified as spiritually corrosive 2,500 years ago has a name in modern psychology now too. It is sometimes called financial anxiety, sometimes called money dysmorphia, a term that has picked up traction in recent years to describe the disconnect between a person's actual financial situation and their persistent, gnawing feeling that they do not have enough, that they are behind, that everyone else is doing better. Surveys conducted across multiple wealthy nations in recent years have found that a majority of adults report feeling anxious about money on a regular basis, even among people whose actual income sits comfortably above the poverty line. The anxiety is not primarily about survival anymore for most of these people. It is about status, comparison, the endless scroll of other people's apparent success, the sense that your net worth is somehow a referendum on your worth as a person. Monks were not trying to solve poverty when they built this rule. They were trying to solve a mental pattern, the pattern where a symbol, a piece of metal, a number on a screen, becomes so tightly fused with your sense of safety and identity that losing it feels like losing yourself. And if you strip away every cultural and religious detail, what you are left with is a strangely direct piece of advice. The object that promises security is often the exact thing generating the insecurity in the first place. The monk who cannot touch money is not poorer in security than you are. He has simply moved the entire question of his security somewhere money cannot reach. None of this means money is evil, and no monastic tradition actually claims that it is. Monasteries need funding. Monks need food, medicine, shelter, all of which cost something in the real world, and the kapia system exists specifically because the tradition never pretended money was unnecessary. What it pretended, or rather, what it insisted on, is that money is dangerous specifically when it moves through you personally, when it becomes something you hold, negotiate, compare, and cling to as an extension of who you are. Consider for a moment how differently modern life is structured. Nearly every major decision in a typical adult life gets filtered through a personal financial calculation. Where you live, who you marry, whether you have children, what career you pursue, how you spend your evenings. All of it runs, at some level, through the question of what you can personally afford, what you personally earn, what you personally owe. The monk deliberately, structurally, removed himself from that entire calculation, not because he found a clever tax loophole, because he decided, formally, ritually, permanently, that the calculation itself was the source of a suffering he no longer wanted to carry. There is something almost funny about the fact that this rule, invented in an era of ox carts and hand-copied scrolls, keeps proving relevant in an era of quarterly earnings reports and retirement calculators, and apps that gamify your spending habits with little celebratory animations when you save $5. The technology changed completely. The metal became paper, became plastic, became a number floating inside a server, somewhere you will never see. But the underlying tension, the grip of the hand around the thing that promises safety, apparently has not changed at all. Think about how strange it is that an institution built around emptying the hands became, over 2,500 years, one of the most financially stable, longest-surviving organizational structures human beings have ever created. Empires collapsed. Currencies were introduced and abandoned, and replaced by other currencies that were themselves eventually abandoned. Entire economic systems, feudalism, mercantilism, colonial extraction, industrial capitalism, rose and reorganized the world, and then gave way to whatever came next. And through all of it, a network of institutions, whose founding members were explicitly forbidden from personally holding a single coin, kept expanding, kept feeding people, kept training new generations of monks, kept standing. There is a lesson buried in that continuity that has nothing to do with religion specifically. Systems built around personal accumulation tend to be fragile in ways their designers rarely anticipate, vulnerable to the very wealth they were built to protect. Systems built around distributed, collective stewardship, where no single person's hand ever closes fully around the resource, tend to survive almost everything thrown at them, including the people trying to exploit them from the inside. None of this requires you to renounce your bank account, sell your possessions, or start eating one meal a day out of a wooden bowl, and nobody involved in this tradition is asking that of you. But it is worth sitting with the specific discomfort of imagining your own hand releasing the thing you assume is keeping you safe. Most people never test that assumption even once in an entire lifetime. They simply grip harder every year, assuming the grip itself is the safety, rather than the source of the exhaustion. So the next time you feel that particular kind of tightness, the one that shows up when you check your bank balance, or compare your salary to a friend's, or feel that small private spike of anxiety scrolling past someone else's vacation photos, it might be worth remembering that a man walking barefoot through a market 2,500 years ago, with an empty bowl and empty hands, identified that exact feeling as the root of the problem, not the number, the grip. He never touched the coin, and somehow, that was the whole point.